Welcome to Craigdarroch Castle. Come on into the main hall and take a look at our beautiful collection of original woodwork, white oak from Arkansas. It makes this beautiful staircase here, 87 steps to the tower, 4.5 floors up to the highest point in Victoria when the house was built in 1890.
Even while under construction, neighbors called it a castle. It was commissioned by British Columbia's first self-made millionaire, who died before he could take occupancy. It was the scene of a family battle over money and power. After the Great War, it served as a military hospital. It was an early home of a college that would one day grow into a university. It served as an office building for the school board. Later, the Music Conservatory and Heritage Society would wrestle over the same space. And finally, restoration. Its name is Gaelic for Rocky Oak Place. It's called Craigdarroch.
Mr. Dunsmuir is one of the richest and most influential men on the Pacific Coast. In financial circles and in Canadian politics, he is recognized as a powerful factor. The story of his life reads like a romance. The Daily Examiner, San Francisco.
Robert Dunsmuir was the son of an Ayrshire family of coal miners and managers. With brighter prospects promised by the Hudson's Bay Company, he departed Scotland in 1850 with his pregnant wife Joan and 2 young daughters. The family, and other miners, traveled first to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia, where son James was born. Then on to Fort Rupert, near today's Port Hardy, a part of a new British colony, Vancouver Island.
Fort Rupert in 1851 was a rough place. It was described as being a place that had fleas without limit. And Robert and Joan occupied a small cabin and a dirt floor. It was very rough, stockade around the fort. And then the initial coal mining wasn't really mining at all. They were just scraping at the banks of the beach.
Vancouver Island was a colony administered by Hudson's Bay factor and later governor, Sir James Douglas. 300 Europeans lived around the newly settled Fort Victoria, with a handful situated further up island. Virtually everyone worked for the company.
It was a unique experiment. You have a private enterprise company running a colony on behalf of the Crown. So the British government still had a presence in the North Pacific after the loss of the Oregon Territory in 1846, but the British taxpayer wasn't charged with the maintenance of this colony.
By 1854, the Dunsmuirs had moved to the tiny village of Nanaimo. Robert worked semi-independently and continued to search for a rich vein of coal to call his own. In 1869, fortune smiled.
I came across a ridge of rock which I knew to be the strata overlying the lowest seam that had as yet been discovered here. A short time afterwards, I sent 2 men to prospect, and in 3 days discovered a seam of coal 3.5 feet in thickness, 30 feet below the tops of the ridge. Robert Dunsmuir.
Robert and Joan arrived here with virtually nothing. They made this enormous discovery of coal in 1869, and in a very short time, by the 1880s, they were millionaires. And in fact, the San Francisco Examiner in 1888 said that they called Robert Dunsmuir Canada's Jay Gould. They estimated his net worth at between $15 and $20 million.
In 1878, only 25 and described by all as clever, the Dunsmuir's second son, Alexander, journeyed to San Francisco to manage the family coal distribution operation. Older son James remained in Departure Bay near Nanaimo to manage the coal loading dock, while Robert Dunsmuir, his wife, and younger daughters eventually moved south to Fairview in Victoria's James Bay, where some of the established gentry viewed them as above their station.
Being Scottish didn't have the same cachet as being English in Victoria in the 1880s. So, there may have been that kind of ethnic rivalry too. But certainly when Robert Dunsmuir would have come here in the 1880s with all his money, he would have run across families like the Creases, like the Pembertons, who considered themselves, and were indeed, the Victoria aristocracy, who had been here for 20, 30 years.
Dunsmuir served as the Nanaimo member in the Provincial Legislative Assembly, where he was a sharp public speaker, and not without a sense of humor, as evidenced when he debated a bill to regulate opium in the province.
I have no objections to support the bill if the use of whisky, beer and tobacco was likewise prohibited. People who used these articles knew what they were about, and the consequences were upon their own heads.
In some circles, they called him the Honourable Bob. Detractors dubbed him King Grab, or the Duke of Wellington. He had his critics for using a heavy hand with strikers and those he considered agitators at his mines, while steadfastly keeping out trade unionists.
In this country, with the wages being paid, the working man, by denying himself what he would otherwise spend, can become a capitalist himself, same as I did. But if he goes on spending everything he makes, he never shall become a capitalist. Robert Dunsmuir.
Dunsmuir the coal baron won widespread credit for building the region's first railways, albeit he greatly benefited from the construction of the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway. In return for the national and provincial charter, 1.9 million acres of land and $750,000 in cash for a 78-mile train line. In 1886, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, paid Dunsmuir a visit. They drove in the ENN's last spike at Shawnigan Lake, and later are reported to have shared a drink at the bottom of a Wellington mine shaft. Sometime later, the railway was extended to Victoria. Banners proclaimed, "Long looked for, come at last," and Dunsmuir, and more of them. As the train arrived at Victoria Station, Robert and Alexander Dunsmuir were greeted by a massive crowd. Then, amid deafening cheers and led by a marching band, rode through the city, their carriage pulled by over 100 men who worked for the Albion Iron Works. But not everyone enjoyed Dunsmuir's company. For example, there was a colorful encounter with an enigmatic former premier and newspaper editor, Amour de Cosmos.
About 11 o'clock, as Mr. Robert Dunsmuir, member of the Provincial Parliament, and ex-Mayor Finlayson were conversing in front of the Bank of British Columbia, they were approached by Mr. Amour de Cosmos, ex-MP, who applied opprobrious epithets to Mr. Dunsmuir. Mr. Dunsmuir requested his insulter, who seemed to be laboring under some strong excitant, to pass on, whereupon Mr. de Cosmos struck him on the side of his head with his fist. Mr. Dunsmuir retaliated by wearing out an umbrella on his assailant's head and shoulders. The combatants were then separated. The Daily Colonist, 1885.
Robert Dunsmuir was a very intelligent person. He wasn't just interested in coal, he was interested in all kinds of things that generated wealth. And he didn't necessarily spend it on himself. He just grew his business. So early on, he started a farm. He was the first person in Nanaimo with a cow. And he started selling crops to other people. And of course, the coal mine was his main business.
At the pinnacle of his career, Dunsmuir decided to build a home that would reflect his success.
On Tuesday evening, a carload of machinery arrived by the Olympian, shipped from Hamburg, Germany, and consigned to the company who intend operating the quarries at Cobble Hill. This is the stone that has been used in the construction of Dunsmuir Castle and is without a doubt the finest sandstone yet discovered on the coast. Victoria Daily Colonist.
Robert Dunsmuir bought and leased a 28-acre parcel of Garryoak Meadow on a rocky bluff overlooking the city and the harbor. He hired Portland architect Warren Williams to design a Scottish baronial mansion. It was designed to be a showcase of success, mirroring the grand homes of his fellow magnates in San Francisco.
When Dunsmuir was contemplating Craigdarroch, there were no houses like this in Canada. There were some in the northeast of the United States, and many of these houses were of a Scottish baronial design. And perhaps Dunsmuir instructed Williams to design a Scottish baronial castle-like house. We don't know for sure.
The sandstone walls came from Dunsmuir's lands, the tile for the roof from a quarry near the New York-Vermont border, the terracotta from California, the fine paneling and staircase produced in Chicago and ordered along with stained glass and other interior fixtures through a catalog.
5 carloads of hardwood finishing were shipped last week at Chicago, consigned to Victoria via the Northern Pacific. This material is for the interior of the Dunsmuir residence. Victoria Daily Colonist.
A San Francisco firm was given the contract to oversee the brick and stonework. A newly arrived gardener from Scotland was placed in charge of the landscaping.
5 more Chinese and 9 quarrymen, 7 wagons and drivers have started with us. Our orders are to do it as we think best, and as economically as possible, but do it right. A Chinese wage is $1.25, and all others from $2 to $3 a day, and tradesmen from $3.50 to $5. Hugh Campbell.
Materials arrived in the harbor and were hauled to the castle by horse and wagon. Everything the best and the most modern.
The castle had electricity when it was built. It had hot and cold running water. There was an alarm system, a burglar alarm, central heating, even though there were 17 fireplaces. And of course the Dunsmuirs had all the coal they needed. But it was a very modern house. It had plumbing. You had bathrooms with bathtubs. It was a very comfortable house.
Furnishings were largely purchased in the United States, although some pieces came from Europe. The estimates of the cost of the mansion range between $185,000 and $500,000.
Craigdarroch symbolizes the ascendancy and the primacy of Victoria in the late Victorian period. By the late 1880s, early 90s, when this building is completed, Victoria is, without question, the metropolitan center of British Columbia. Even though Vancouver has been established in the mid-1880s, Vancouver isn't going to overcome Victoria for another 10, 15 years. So the Dunsmuirs in this home represented not only their success in the coaling industry. By this time they own the Albion Iron Works, largest employer in Victoria. They have a major interest in the colonist newspaper, in printing firms. It very much was the acme of Victorian economic life.
Robert Dunsmuir had built a house to match his ambition and success. He had a premonition, however, reinforced by a local spiritualist that he shared with others, that he wouldn't live to see the house completed. And sure enough, in April 1889, at the age of 63, he did indeed pass away.
The head rested lightly upon a pillow of roses against the white satin linings of the casket of death. Victoria Daily Colonist.
As many as 14,000 lined the streets as Dunsmuir's casket was led from St. Andrew's Church to its final burial place. Schools were closed, and bells of all the city churches, St. Anne's Convent, and local fire halls tolled throughout the funeral.
He was a man of work rather than words, the kind of true heart that he ever had for the land of his adoption. Victoria Daily Colonist.
In an action unusual for the times, Robert Dunsmuir left his business and wealth all in the hands of his widow, Joan. Robert intended to sign another will, which handed the business to sons James and Alexander, but it was never signed, as the doctor had assured him his illness was not going to be fatal. The seeds of discontent had been sown. Joan Dunsmuir moved to the castle in October 1890. with her youngest unmarried daughters, Effie, Jessie, and Maud, as well as recently orphaned grandchildren Elizabeth and Robert. Craigdarroch became an instant city attraction, with postcards soon sold in downtown stores. But the owner was not impressed.
We lived next door to Craigdarroch, and my mother spoke to Mrs. Dunsmuir, who said she found the castle too ostentatious and she wasn't comfortable living there. Mrs. Montague Bruce.
The family soon settled in, typically supported by 4 to 6 servants who waited on the Dunsmuirs' needs and maintained the spacious drawing room, sitting room, library, 8 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, 17 fireplaces, and 21 flights of interior and exterior stairs.
In this house of this style, that kind of quintessential upstairs-downstairs environment, we know from a census of 1891 that the Dunsmuirs had live-in staff, and we can identify them. They had gardeners, they had cooks, they had domestics. In many big houses like this, that would be the norm.
Life was comfortable, with plenty of recreation and several important family events. In 1891, Jessie Dunsmuir, with 30 bridesmaids in attendance, was married to the Irish baronet Sir Richard Musgrave, with much pomp and ceremony. In 1903, granddaughter Elizabeth Harvey wed local businessman George Kirk. So on the domestic front, life was good. But from 1889 to 1908, things were far from tranquil for the Dunsmuirs. Joan Dunsmuir disapproved of Alexander living in San Francisco with a divorced woman. She also disapproved of his heavy drinking.
I'd rather see Alec in his grave than married to that woman, Joan Dunsmuir.
Meantime, older brother James was moving up the social ladder, and in 1900 became premier of the province. However, despite James's best efforts, his younger brother's drunken exploits continued.
He would come up to Victoria to meet with his brother and also to work with him on their mother to get her to sell this business. On one occasion, at dinner, Alex was in such a state that his mother told him to go up and go to bed. Well, he didn't like this, and so he stormed out the kitchen door and fell on some stone stairs outside. The valet was sent out to find him, and Alex was unconscious. He was brought into the house and put to bed, and there he suffered hallucinations for days before his brother came here and took him and put him down on a boat down in the inner harbor, and he went off to Montreal.
Over the next 10 years following their father's death, James and Alec were able to persuade their mother to gradually hand over the family business. Trouble brewed when Alex suddenly died from complications from alcoholism, and James Dunsmuir refused to hand back his brother's share of the company to his mother. She took him to court.
Mrs. Joan Dunsmuir, widow of Robert Dunsmuir, founder of the fortune of British Columbia's wealthiest family, has entered an action against her son, James Dunsmuir, Premier of British Columbia. New York Times.
Joan Dunsmuir lost her lawsuit, then firmly shut her doors to James, who would soon rise to the post of lieutenant governor and build his own baronial mansion called Hatley Castle, now part of Royal Roads University.
I went to Craigdarroch in hopes of facilitating a reconciliation between my father James and grandmother. She said, "Did your father send you?" And I replied, "No." And grandmother responded, "Well, I'm not making the first move." Bessie Dunsmuir.
In 1908, Joan Dunsmuir handed over her money, her castle, and its acreage to her daughters for $2. Then shortly after, died at the age of 80. As a sad postscript, her estranged son James collapsed in grief at her funeral.
We have come to an era of change. In the case of Craigdarroch, the family having been scattered for some years, and its revered owner having gone to her rest, there is nothing like a rude shock in this complete change in its history. Victoria Daily Colonist.
turn of the century Victoria was a very different place from the small fort it had been when the Dunsmuirs first arrived nearly 60 years earlier. It had grown quickly as the administrative center for a succession of interior gold rushes. Victoria was incorporated in 1862. This 1907 footage, taken on a streetcar by William Harbeck, shows a prosperous city that had steadily grown to over 30,000 residents. It's noteworthy that this early filmmaker would in 1912 perish in the sinking of the Titanic. Following Joan Dunsmuir's death, her surviving daughters wanted to sell their property. First, the artwork and furnishings were sold over 3 days at an auction. Then, developer Griffith Hughes bought the castle and its 28 acres in an unconventional arrangement. He paid the Dunsmuir daughters $30,000 for the castle, with more revenue promised from the sale of the property, which was divided into 144 lots. The lots were slow to sell, so a lottery was staged, where every person who bought a plot would have a chance at no extra expense to own the castle. The winner was contractor Solomon Cameron, who intended to use the building as collateral to fund other construction projects.
The new owners, it is believed, will dispose of their new acquisition, having no intention of occupying the premises. Victoria Daily Times.
Cameron's business did not thrive. The castle remained largely empty between 1908 and 1919, when the Bank of Montreal finally foreclosed. In 1914, the outbreak of the Great War was the focus of most people's attention. Until peace came in 1918, over 5,000 men from Victoria served their country overseas. Also marching were 72 locally trained nursing sisters.
Everybody was worried about getting to the war before it ended. So there was a huge burst of enlistment early on.
Casualties in the First War were appalling. 1 in 10 Canadians who went overseas were killed. Among the dead, James Dunsmuir Jr., the family heir, who perished in 1915 when the Lusitania was torpedoed. Along with the dead, thousands were wounded, and medical services were stretched to intense levels. With improved treatments and care, seriously injured men were returning in higher numbers than ever before.
So a lot more people that were badly wounded survived, and so a lot of people missing limbs and whatnot were starting to come home from fairly early on. The Canadians were involved in the first major gas attack of the war, and gas produced ongoing medical problems that lasted for a long, long time with people.
The Government of Canada responded to the flood of returning wounded veterans with a string of new facilities across the country. At the end of the war, Craigdarroch was leased from the bank and renovated as a veterans hospital.
Massive walls were removed. This room, for example, part of Joan Dunsmuir's bathroom, was completely gutted. There's a photograph showing all the debris taken out of this window with a chute. Stained glass windows, fortunately, were retained, but this bank of bathroom stalls went in.
When all was prepared, a large crowd gathered at every vantage point, awaiting a very special guest. Edward, the Prince of Wales, who would later famously abdicate his throne for an American divorcee, traveled to Victoria in 1919 as part of a royal world tour. After waving to adoring crowds at the BC legislature, the prince officially opened Craigdarroch Military Hospital.
All the up patients were standing to their beds. 4 warriors who were badly injured remained in bed. The prince spent considerable time in conversation with the crippled heroes, who were now making the castle their home. Victoria Daily Times.
By April 1920, 812 men had been treated at Craigdarroch. Some were bedridden, while many others were day patients who received both treatment and training on the castle grounds.
On the grounds of Craigdarroch, there was a shed, a building, also designed by a veteran, a local veteran, where you would learn basketry, or painting, or woodwork, some other kind of useful trade.
By 1921, a larger veterans' hospital at Shaughnessy was established, and Craigdarroch's military role ended, with a speedy transition.
Many of the rooms were still numbered with the ward names, Ward 7, Ward 4, Ward 6, and so these names stuck with the rooms. Most of the place was in very good condition because the military hospital folks had maintained it to a very high standard. So it was really a very suitable place for a college.
Victoria College was born on the top floor of Victoria High School. It was founded in 1902 through an affiliation with McGill University.
4 of the students were girls in very lovely gowns. It was quite different to school these days. And 3 of them were men, and one of the male students was Joe Clarihue, who actually helped to establish UVic.
Victoria College struggled off and on in its early years, but in 1921, now an extension of UBC, the college moved to Craigdarroch with 100 students enrolled. A beautiful new building with Spartan interior.
Slat benches, they weren't, no cushions or anything, and they were just not very comfortable. I suppose that was to mean to keep you awake. It worked.
One could make the claim that there isn't a finer building in the Canadian university world in 1924 than here.
The college curriculum would provide the first 2 years towards an undergraduate degree. The college offered small classes with excellent instruction.
Well, we did have one English professor, a little woman, Miss Ruth Humphreys, and she could hardly reach the lectern, but she had this great black cloak. She used to pull it up over her shoulders, and really the whole group of class would giggle, and she'd look very sternly at us. But that was always a funny episode.
Roughly 5,000 students would attend classes at the castle over 25 years, including the likes of Canadian journalist and author Pierre Burton, who, like others, left his mark.
Well, I carved my initials. I think I carved my name on the windowsill. And I understand now it's a tourist attraction.
Burton was also well known on campus for helping to produce the Microscope student newspaper.
Typed it out myself and wrote most of it. Ivan Mowat and Harry Parrott, I did it. We drew the headlines and put it on the bulletin board. And as opposed to high school, where I had been sneered at by the teachers for doing this paper, that was a terrible thing. The professor at the college thought it was a good idea. And they used to take an interest in me and in the paper because of that.
Other notable Victoria College students included future Aboriginal artist Bill Reid and scientist Francis Kelsey, who would later receive a Distinguished Civilian Service Award from President John F. Kennedy. Campus life was rich, with plenty of sports teams to cheer for. Rugby was a big draw, complete with cheerleaders and Lucky the mascot.
We'd come and watch the rugby games and hope that our date wasn't going to get a concussion because he was going to take us to the dance that night, and that did happen occasionally.
There were plenty of social occasions, dances complete with orchestra. There were also lots of clubs and special events, which included Frosh Week for new students.
Our initiation was walking around for, I think it was a week, with a big placard on our back with our telephone number on it, the girls.
By the 1930s, Victoria had grown to 40,000 residents. The Depression was felt by many, yet this seat of government continued to bustle. its downtown distinctly British in character. College students relying on streetcars to get around the city. College life shifted when the Second World War broke out in 1939 and dramatically changed after 1945 at the war's end, with returning veterans crowding classrooms.
They learned quickly, they knew what they wanted to do, but once in a while their language got a little out of hand and they'd say, oops, I forgot their ladies present. But, you know, it was just fun. They were among the best students some of the best students I've ever taught.
The post-war created a dilemma for Craigdarroch. Student enrollment ballooned from 200 to over 600, and veterans in particular found this unacceptable.
The NDP, what was then the CCF, probably came closest to forming a government immediately after the war, and a lot of it was unrest and a demand for the social safety net that we now assume from veterans returning. And in fact, Mackenzie King's Liberal government just adopted a lot of their policy, and that's what kept him in power.
Led by the veterans, students marched, many in step, to the BC legislature, demanding better facilities immediately. And they were listened to.
This is some kind of Commonwealth record, I think, for government dispatch on these issues. And then when they moved from here, they carried everything pretty much. You know, so the students and the faculty and the staff, they walked up carrying things up to it was called well, some called it the Long March, but I think that was in retrospect.
So Victoria College relocated to the former normal school, and later, in 1963, students and faculty would move again to a new home, the University of Victoria. Meanwhile, Craigdarroch was again vacant, but not for long.
The transition of the castle from college to school board was gradual. That is to say, they didn't immediately begin painting everything and installing linoleum. It was a gradual thing. Many of the cabinets and casework that we see, and some of it that we still retain, is clearly from the 50s and 60s. So as the school board grew, the office grew, the city grew, then the changes occurred in the castle itself.
Green institutional walls, fluorescent lights, still a lovely building, but much more utilitarian for the school board, including pink walls in the superintendent's office in the front portico. Generally, staff enjoyed the building, although its age was felt on cold winter mornings.
I remember my first year here, they had to shovel coal into the furnace to keep us warm. And it was a difficult place to keep warm because look at all the nooks and crannies. But by the end of the day, the offices were warm. But when you came in the morning, it was pretty cool.
Every room had a utilitarian purpose, including the former Dunsmuir dining room, now used for school board meetings, as recalled by the son of a former school board superintendent.
In the school board days, of course, it was very utilitarian. It was the battlefield. This is the battlefield for the discussion of policies and new directions for the future. In those days, new schools, if being built, had to be passed by referenda. That meant the raising of public taxes for the developing of certain new schools. So those were hard-fought issues.
A silver lining. The institutional paint and linoleum would in the long run prove to be a protection for the floors, walls, and ceilings. And even in its institutional guise, Craigdarroch still attracted hundreds of tourists who walked into the building unannounced. Staff didn't mind, as they were proud of their surroundings.
Oh, very, very proud, because people would say, well, where do you work? I would say, in a castle. And they thought, in a castle? And I said, yes, up there, Craigdarroch Castle.
In 1968, the board had outgrown the castle, so again, it was vacated. A spirited debate got underway during the last days of the castle's occupancy by the school board. Should Craigdarroch remain an office building, a museum, or should it be knocked down in the name of progress? History professor Sidney Jackman described Craigdarroch as very big, very prominent, very uninteresting.
There was that notion that Victorian era structures were archaic, antiquarian, ugly, and that modern was more progressive.
You know, people wanted to put a Space Needle on the south lawn. They wanted to put miniature castle displays and have a steak and seafood restaurant in the castle, that sort of thing.
But as Craigdarroch's future seemed to hang in the balance, a new figure swung into action.
I am here deep in the heart of the provincial archives in Victoria, the very fountainhead of all the information that is coming for this, our centennial year.
James K. Nesbitt was a long-time political reporter, and heritage was his passion. He once famously defended the tile floors of the BC legislature, which were scheduled to be replaced. Symbolically, he held his ground with a shotgun and won the argument. Nesbitt was no less passionate about Craigdarroch.
He had one single thought in mind, and that was that he wanted to restore the Craigdarroch Castle to a degree where people would be proud of it, would want to go to the castle, look through it, and leave money behind for future work done on the castle and its surroundings at the place.
Mr. Premier, would you tell us what it is you hope to accomplish in Ottawa?
Nesbitt enlisted the support of Premier W.A.C. Bennett and just about anyone else he could find with influence to establish the Castle Preservation Society in 1959. He demanded access to restore castle rooms and accommodate tourists. Success was achieved, but only in part. The Victoria Conservatory of Music was also seeking a home for its 430 students and 40 staff members. The city decided to lease the building to the musicians led by Robin and Winifred Wood, who brought in 30 pianos.
I remember going throughout it and thinking how huge it was, and and the atmosphere was wonderful, and it looked like a European conservatory.
Craigdarroch rooms were filled with music from dawn till dusk. Many who went on to professional careers fondly looked back on their lessons learned.
If you don't leave this studio a better cellist than I am, I haven't done my job. Imagining the teacher to have so little ego as to expect that the student will be better than them, and to admit that. It always stayed with me.
Performers like international opera star Richard Margeson well remember recitals in the castle drawing room when they performed for small but appreciative audiences.
Those were great evenings. We had great audiences, and everybody was there just for the love of music. And in that surround, doing it in that room, this sort of opulent setting, it was sort of like the movie Sense and Sensibilities, where people, that was their entertainment. They didn't have television or computers, and you'd go over to somebody's drawing room and they'd put on a concert, which was inspiring.
Music played mixed with tension from the castle society, which the city had also allowed to occupy the building, albeit only the front hallway, library, and dining room, which shared access to the drawing room, which meant neither group was happy.
Yes, you would see sometimes Nesbitt yelling out to students, "Don't run on the stairs," or grumble about the occupation of the rooms, or wonder when Mr. Wood was going to be finished with the room behind us and let folks in.
Yeah, we were hostile towards him.
And he was hostile towards us because, he had the agenda of saving the place. And we didn't appreciate that, really. I don't think, to the extent that, that it was a place that had archaeological, historical value and would have to be one day preserved and brought back to the way it is becoming so today. So yeah, we weren't on his team at all.
It was never a happy marriage. James Nesbitt disliked the wear and tear on a heritage treasure. Conversely, the musicians loved the castle, but not the interruptions of touring groups often led by Nesbitt.
He would come in with half a dozen people and talk about the stained glass window and what a beautiful room it is and the lovely fireplace, and all this would be going on. The student and I would be standing looking at our watches, thinking this lesson time has to be made up somewhere. It was quite unconscionable.
I rather think it was his desire to be difficult for the conservatory and all the people around it, so they would go. So they would really see that the two functions were not compatible.
In 1979, the Music Conservatory, now with 1,200 students and tiring of working in a tourist attraction, looked for a new space and found it at St. Anne's Annex.
Well, when we moved into the little school of St. Anne's, there were an entire floor that could be vocal, and then another entire wing over this where the piano studios were.
Yeah, that must have been a luxury after this. But.
No, actually. It felt like a hospital.
A lot of us students always said, wouldn't it be nice if we could come back here? Because that was just so unique. Yeah. Actually, it brings tears to my eyes.
Upon the conservatory's departure, the Castle Society was given a lease by the city to oversee the building and grounds. James Nesbitt would pass away 2 years later, but the work of restoration continued with vigor. Exterior work to repair and replace slates and railings on the roof, repairs to masonry, and rooms painted in hues more familiar to the Dunsmuir era.
Recreating the period interiors of Craigdarroch Castle is a real challenge because all of the things were auctioned in 1909. Mrs. Dunsmuir died, her children sold the whole contents of the house. Fortunately, an auction catalog survived, and so we have this listing of things that were sold from the house. Sadly, there's only one interior photograph that has survived from that period. But using these two documents, we get a good idea of how the Dunsmuirs decorated the house.
For those who spent many years at the castle as college or music students, even society members, the restoration was a revelation.
I'm utterly astonished at the huge amount of significance and progression and preservation of this great building. It's really staggering.
A castle for all seasons, plenty of special programs, and heritage decorations to reflect the seasons. Christmas at the castle, particularly beautiful and historic. Besides plays, there have been movie productions that have transformed Craigdarroch to a movie set. In at least one case, it was refashioned on the exterior to look like a haunted mansion. Celebrities graced the castle hallways: Phyllis Diller, Malcolm McDowell, Roger Moore, and Shadow, the Black Jaguar. A site of many events, such as Lieutenant Governor Gardy Gardam presiding over BC Day celebrations, and other more personal ceremonies, with brides and grooms from around the world using the castle as a backdrop, none more effectively than the great-great-great-grandson of Robert Dunsmuir. In 1990, Dorothy Laundy, the castle's chatelaine, cut a 100th anniversary cake, And 4 years later, Victoria Mayor Bob Cross accepted a symbolic $1 in payment as the city lease ended and full ownership was granted to the nonprofit society. Challenges abound, as an average of 140,000 visit the castle every year.
You know, the glass half full, not half empty, and moving on and ahead and planning, because it's taken a lot of planning to bring the castle to where it is today. You know, a lot of planning, a lot of hard work, a lot of research, and it's not been, I'm sure, not been easy, but it certainly it demonstrates what can be done.
Carefully managing finances, the Heritage Society soldiers on. Expensive structural issues remain, including the problem of deteriorating sandstone. Meanwhile, plans are being carefully studied for new restoration, including the former castle kitchen. Since the installation of a new administrative center and gift store in an adjacent craftsman house, it's now possible to restore the kitchen, a big draw in any historic house. Some rooms have been returned to their Dunsmuir splendor. Others are being studied to eventually restore memories of other eras, the hospital, the college, the conservatory, thus providing diverse layers of history.
The odd thing is, when I look at the rooms now, and I look at the detail now, when I was that age, I mean, it was all part of the ambiance, yes, don't get me wrong, but I don't think we noticed it as much as you would notice it now, you know, because we were focused on, I had lessons in here with Robin Wood, and I wasn't looking at the walls or, you know, and I had lessons in Studio A most of the time with Winifred Wood, and when I was in that room just today looking at all the detail, I thought, I don't remember all this detail in this room.
Craigdarroch was built as a symbol of success, and so it remains today. And the hope remains that succeeding generations will equally embrace this majestic building and its rich history, which is our proud heritage.
We want to make sure that this is the city's castle, that this is going to be something which, in the future, our children and those who come after them will say, yes, you know, my parents did something to help that wonderful place continue. Their parents before them had done that as well.
Thank you for joining us at Craigdarroch Castle. We hope you had a wonderful time. Please visit us again. We've been here for over 100 years, and we'll be here when you come back.
James Dunsmuir, Premier of British Columbia, New York Times. Again?
All I would say is that it's not a premiere like a premiere at a movie.
Premier?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it? Premier.
Premier, yeah.
Premier.
He's a premier.
Premier, okay, premier, okay.
Other than that, it's
premier, oh, I see, premier, okay. You know, I never realized the difference between those two words,
yeah,
okay.
well, and I've noticed that because I know other Americans, they will also say premiere when they say it, because that's how you would normally read it. So
I never realized that.
It's a premier, yeah.
I'm becoming a Canadian.
Oh my God.
Oh my God, right. You better watch out.
Oh, no. And Jim Nesbitt and I were sitting next to each other in the press gallery. And I said to Jim, what, that looked like a fire down there. This is about 11 o'clock at night. He says, yeah, let's go out and take a look. So we went down below and got between the two buildings of the legislature and looked toward the bird cages. There was only one left, and it was on fire. And all I heard was, oh my God, and that was Jim. And so I looked at him, and there were tears in his eyes.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
No? You know, my favorite.
any particular point you want me to start, or just?
I will count you in. I'll just sort of say
Okay.
3, 2, 1, and then
Okay.
you go. So we're rolling and we're set. So 3, 2.
I came across a ridge of rock which I knew to be the strata overlying the lowest seam that had as yet been discovered here. A short time afterwards, I sent 2 men to prospect, and in 3 days discovered a seam of coal 3.5 feet in thickness, 30 feet below the tops of the ridge. Robert Dunsmuir.